Good evening, and once again, welcome to another edition of the Extended Shadow Gallery. I am, as always, your host, James Donnelly. And, well, right now we're going to talk about, a year in comics. A year that changed everything, really. And that year is 1986. Now, I'm doing as kind of a prelude to, because you'll be seeing also, well, if you're watching this tonight, some of you over in the UK or in Europe might see this tonight, might watch this tonight, and probably most of my American friends will watch this tomorrow. In which case, tomorrow will be the day that I'll also be uploading the sixth part in the comic book community crossover of the reviews of the individual issues of Watchmen, which I'm very glad to be a part of. And I've seen some reviews thus far, and they've been outstanding. I'm really glad that everybody's keeping kind of to their own style, and that even some of them have really brought out some big guns and done an incredible amount of research into the actual issues themselves, into the themes, and really helped to deconstruct what some of these issues are about. But what I really want to talk about is the year 1986. Because in the year 1986, we got two things, both coming out of DC Comics. We got this. We got Watchmen. Now this is the copy that I bought for my wife when she was still living in Canada, which is why it has the the newer, much cleaner look to it, and has the one of Time's 100 best Time Magazine's 100 best novels. Hugo Award winning, as the newer, not the newest, but the newer DC logo. And it's not tattered and torn. It has a whole bunch of quotes on the back and all that kind of stuff. So it brought us Watchmen by Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons. And John Higgins doing art, or doing coloring. And it also brought us this, which is in my book, what was the complete Frank Miller Batman. This came out sometime in the 90s, when Frank Miller had only done year one, a short Batman story about Santa Claus that was published back in I believe in the early 80s. But also then we had here, in this section here, we have the complete of The Dark Knight Returns. Now, so we have two very different publications. But we had basically, and this is where Ghost Critic, in his review of Watchmen issue 3, At Midnight All the Agents, I believe, basically had talked about his love-hate relationship with Watchmen. And the same can very similarly be said of The Dark Knight Returns. Now basically, for those of you who don't know, and I can't imagine that there's any of you, but The Dark Knight Returns is basically, it's a straight up superhero story, and it's also a very biting satire at the same time of not only straight up superhero stories, but of the characters that inhabit them, and also of the current socio-economic and political climates that we were facing at that time. So this, The Dark Knight Returns, was such a massive, caused such a massive media storm, mostly because it was the first book, and there were books before this, obviously. You had, obviously, just throwing a couple names out there, you had, Robert Crumb doing some really advanced stuff. You had, people like, people like Alan Moore that were doing some really adult-oriented work, either in 2000 AD or in his run on the Saga of the Swamp Thing, where they actually decided to take the comic book code, the Comics Code Authority label off and said, this is mature horror. And so again, this is, Ralph Bakshi. These were people that were creating cartoons, comic book characters that were not widely accepted. They were still very much fringe, of course, at that point. But basically, what kind of indie music would be to, what we have on the top 40s. Now, Batman is still a book that's in it's top of the pops, man. You can't get much bigger than Batman. You had 1989. You had the Batman film. It was the biggest film of that year. Made made close to 300 million domestic. And then just skipping forward almost 20 years, you had in 2008 you had The Dark Knight, which is the third biggest motion picture of all time, I think, from a world box office standpoint. So this is a very popular character. When a lot of people think of comic books, they think of Batman or Superman or Spider-Man. Now, so when this came out in 1986, and it was a mature reader's book, and it garnered so much attention, not just because of how it was constructed, from Frank Miller and Klaus Janson and Lynn Varley, all their color use, their inking, just the whole style of it looked much grittier and grimmer and just darker than anything we'd seen from Batman before. Because even the darker stuff that O'Neill and Adams and Steve Englehart and Frank Robbins and Marshall Rogers were doing in the 70s, it was pretty dark, but it was still, it still had, it brought the darkness back. We had the Dark Knight detective now. The Cape Crusader was gone. No, not entirely gone. He was still very much the Cape Crusader, but, he had been rescued from the, corny, gag-infested, parody of the Batman television show from the 60s. And they said, you know what, we want it to go back to the Bob Kane, Bill Finger roots, which I'm glad they didn't go all that far back. They actually infused it with more modern storytelling ideas, and of course, the art of the comic book artist had obviously come a long way since 1939. So anyway, but this caught, it touched off a media firestorm, because no one had ever seen Batman this dark. There's a lot of adult language being used. There's this woman with swastikas painted on her breasts, and people, newscasters, news people were approaching people like Adam West and Burt Ward, and they're asking, what do you think about this? And they're like, I'm just appalled. That's what most people were really turned off at first. But then there were people that were smart enough to see this is on a, we've broken free of comic books just being for kids, and they can actually be literary and have social significance. They can be smart. They can be very stylized, and they can be done in such a fashion that it'll explode. It has no other choice. And because Frank Miller could have done, like he did with Holy Terror very recently, he could have made up a whole new character for this. But it was very important that he told this story of Batman, because this was his way of making people aware that comic books didn't have to just be for kids, because it had been, hacking away at it for a long time by, obviously by doing Daredevil for quite some time, not just drawing it first, but then actually moving on to, co-plotting it and then just writing and drawing it. He made that book really dark. He made, then he created Ronin, which a lot of people ignored because, again, it was a very fringe kind of title, even though it was being put out by DC. There was no Vertigo at that time. And so it changed the conversation. I mean, just like we hear and we see so many things nowadays, people keep talking about. One of the buzzwords is changing the conversation. For instance, like how Occupy Wall Street has changed the conversation politically about our economic differences, and so that's just an example. For or against, I'm not talking about that here. But it changed the way that people started talking about the economic imbalance in society all around the world. I mean, it was and so, but The Dark Knight Returns, obviously we have, this, Bruce Wayne is in his 50s, he's hung up the suit, been 10 years since anybody's seen Batman. And of course, Gotham has just been getting, it's been gradually getting worse, but not to a point where it needed a Batman to fill that hole. And then all of a sudden, out of the woodwork, here comes Harvey Dent, who has had his face completely restored. And of course, Batman comes on the scene, and he's fighting Two-Face, and he's fighting the mutants, the gang. And he's, as was also taken the idea of the inspiration of the idea of a Batman. We have this young girl, kind of flighty, but is apparently, an exceptional gymnast, and also knows computers very well. She's just a kid, and she's, so inspired by what Batman's been doing. Also she has her hippie parents and everything like that. So in her rebellion, she joins up with Batman. And, of course, as soon as Batman reemerges on the scene, the Joker actually has been safely tucked away in Arkham Asylum for 10 years in a catatonic trance, essentially. Then, of course, he sees a news report about Batman that he's back, and all of a sudden he just snaps right out of it. So the Joker's back on the scene. So it talks, it also really begins to, for the first time, really explore the psychology of Batman's villains, particularly his biggest, being the Joker. That part of the Joker's existence, and again, this was also explored not only in The Dark Knight, the film, but also in Alan Moore and Brian Bolland's The Killing Joke, which is there's two sides of the same coin. These obsessive, people that they're going to destroy each other. But if they didn't have to, they're almost kindred spirits. So, I mean, again, it was really one of the first comic books to ever take the idea of a character and elevate it beyond that of just being a character. They actually infused life back into Batman. And of course, later that year, we got the beginning of Batman Year One, which, in my opinion, is, it's my favorite Batman story of all time, and certainly one of the greatest, comic books of all time. Even though it was, 4 issues of the regular Batman title, 404 to 407. But then also that year, at the same time, because if you go back to 1986, and you'll see when they used to have checklists, well, they've kind of brought them back now, but only really if it's like a crossover type of thing, Ends of the Earth and Spider-Man, or, Avengers versus X-Men right now, you have a little checklist on, okay, well, this issue is coming up this month, and so on and so forth. But they used to have these great little rundowns of every book that was coming out that month, and little descriptions. And in 1986, there would be, okay, here's Watchmen number 2 is coming out at the same time, it's coming out the same month as Dark Knight Returns number 3 or number 4. So they were going on at the same time. These 2 books that changed everything. And I'm not going to get into Watchmen as far as plot-wise or, as far as an analysis-wise, because we're going to leave that to, this big crossover that we're doing. I know I keep doing this sign whenever I'm saying crossover, but it also, and this is again, talking about what Ghost Critic was saying about his love-hate relationship with Watchmen, the reason for that being, really, that he says that while it's an extraordinary piece of work, it's the only comic book ever to be in, I think, maybe with the exception of Mao's, and if I'm not terribly mistaken, I think that came out in 1987 or 88. And if it's earlier, and if it was also in, in these earlier years, like 85 or 86, feel free to correct me. I'm sure I'll Wikipedia it as soon as I'm done, and I'll feel stupid. But again, the fact that Mao's was a comic book was almost ancillary, because it really was, it could have been a novel, but it was a comic book. It didn't necessarily have to be told in comic book form. This was a big discussion that I was having with a lot of other people during one of Brian Augustine's Comic Book Insider podcasts from Gotham City Comics and Coffee in Mesa here, where I live, or nearby where I live. And, so the literary aspects of Mao's are a little bit different than what we see from, like I said, because there's no existing characters in that. Now, of course, Batman Dark Knight Returns, it's Batman, so that pretty much has to be a comic book. And Watchmen is based on Charlton comic characters, so that can really only be told through comic book form. It doesn't have the option of being a novel. So, or at least not to work as well as it does. But that, again, going back to Ghost Critic's point, because I keep going off on other tangents, but that he loves it because it is such an incredible piece of work, incredible piece of art, incredible piece of comic book history. But what's not so great about it is that it birthed, partially responsible anyway, of birthing this massive movement towards darker characters, darker stories. Everything changed because of these 2 books, because they were so, at the time they were either being very incredibly panned, or they were being beloved, because they were very, very divisive, and they still kind of are. Because there are people who are very happy with just thinking of the of comic books being comic books. You got bad guys beating up, you got good guys beating up bad guys beating up good guys, and it doesn't get to a point where we can really examine motivation or their own inner selves. And that was where, because I think in the 70s, when we were going through the Bronze Age, things had kind of petered out. There wasn't really anything new to do anymore. There was no next frontier, it seemed like. And then you had, like I said, you had Frank Miller doing Daredevil or Marvel. You had the kind of British invasion of all these writers, Neil Gaiman, Alan Moore, and all these artists, like Dave Gibbons, Brian Bolland, so many different people coming from the UK that had gotten their start working for 2000 AD or Marvel UK titles. Jamie Delano, whatever. I mean, all of these people started coming over to the US, and they started changing the game. It was, like I said, they said to themselves, we don't have to do this anymore. We don't have to just play by the rules. We can do something. We can push the boundaries even further. And that, yes, it did take away comic books' innocence. I mean, because if we look back to the 1950s, and of course, the congressional hearings, the Wortham's Seduction of the Innocent book, the kind of witch hunt, because obviously, one of the things when we talk about Frederick Wortham, one of the reasons that he saw that he believed that comic books caused juvenile delinquency is because he was interviewing juvenile delinquents whose only real source of reading material were comic books. So he said, oh, there must be some sort of connection here, which there really wasn't. It wasn't a cause and effect situation. Of course, we know that now. But, it was just, but at that time, it seemed perfectly plausible that our kids are being corrupted by crime and suspense stories, and there's a man holding a woman's severed head on the cover, and you got shock and suspense stories where you've got a fucking guy, he's blowing his own head off on the cover, and you have vampires and zombies and demons and werewolves from Tales from the Crypt or Vault of Horror, all the great EC comics. They were doing really dark shit back in that era. But once the comic code, the self-censorship of the comic code came about, because it really was, there was no way out for the comic book world at that point in time, because they just, all they had, it was either that or censorship by the government, and they didn't want that. So they said to themselves, okay, look, we've got to, we have to kowtow to what they want. And unfortunately, it destroyed one man, it destroyed Bill Gaines, essentially. It destroyed his revolutionary company, EC, which is which has still to this day put out some of the best crime comics and best horror comics that I've ever seen published. And so then, everything, and then they kind of started to bring some of that back in the late 60s and early 70s with like House of Mystery and House of Secrets and so on and so forth. But the titles, then you had, the kind of more upstart companies, like Harris and what have you, doing Vampirella and doing Creepy, and it was the same types of stories, but they just weren't, they were, since they were kind of fringe, they were still kind of outside the comics code. They were more magazine size, so they could be sold as magazines and not be on the same stand as comic books, but they were, for all intents and purposes, they were comic books. So anyway, so they've, all these people, all of these kind of forward-thinking people felt, okay, we've been stuck inside this bubble for too long. The Silver Age has come along, Silver Age has come and gone, essentially. We're now in, late, at that time they didn't really call it the Bronze Age. We're calling it that now. And I'm sure that they'll come up, and this ushered in, but these are the people that ushered in the modern age, what is now referred to as the modern age of comics. And I'm sure that in another 10 or 15 years, we're going to call it something else. We'll have to reclassify Golden Age, Silver Age, Bronze Age, Modern Age. It'll have to be something different because modern is not going to be modern anymore. But there's no going. But I guess the point that I'm trying to make here is that after Dark Knight Returns and after Watchmen, there was no going back. Because not only were they divisive, but they were hugely popular. And so, I mean, from that point on, we had V for Vendetta, which in my opinion is not only the greatest comic book that's ever been written, but it's honestly my favorite piece of literature. I know a lot of you are going to think that's really strange, but it's true. Because that is honestly something that could have worked as a novel, and I think deserves more praise than it's given. But that's me, because this is the Shadow Gallery after all. I don't call it that just because of the Shadow, because I love the Shadow. I call it that because that's V's home, and this is my home, and it's the Shadow Gallery. But and then of course the Killing Joke. And then, this... But then, everything did change. And not necessarily for the better. You had, in 86, again, if I'm not terribly mistaken, you had Marvel Superhero Secret Wars. Now, this was, Marvel's attempt to one-up DC's Crisis on Infinite Earths from 1985, where we had the beginning of the Maxi series and the crossovers into all of these different comic books. But just as an example, Spider-Man gets the black suit. So I mean, he still he can go around in the red and blues, but now he's doing the black suit thing. And we have the idea of the symbiote and everything like that, this alien suit, and we have then we went from Amazing Spider-Man, Spectacular Spider-Man, and Marvel Team Up featuring Spider-Man, all these kind of happy, kind of really positive sounding titles, and then very shortly after these books, we had Web of Spider-Man. And Web of Spider-Man, if you remember that cover, it was a very dark, it was Spider-Man in the black suit, kind of perched on these kind of like gargoyles, and it just, the lighting's very dark. There's nothing dynamic about it as far as from a eye-popping color standpoint. The thing that's dynamic about it is that it's so dark. And this was the direction that all of the comics started taking. Batman was no longer the Caped Crusader or even the Dark Knight Detective. He was just the Dark Knight. Superman went from being the Man of Steel to becoming the last son of Krypton. The last son of Krypton. So, I mean, you have this really, I'm a Man of Steel, I'm the last son of Krypton. I mean, you can kind of, you see the way that things were changing. It's just that it was, we had gone from uplifting to depressing. He is, he's the only one. So I mean, you had these, again, these really brightly colored characters becoming very, very dark and very gritty all of a sudden, when they didn't necessarily need to be. And, this is something that, now, the time that we're in now, for instance, because the 90s was really, I mean, it was a stockpiling of dark heroes. You know, and of course, and we had some dark anti-heroes before this time period. We had the Punisher. You know, when when it was the Punisher magazine, you know, it was printed all in black and white. You know, that was some pretty hardcore stuff, man. And, you know, then, you know, the Punisher, you know, limited series, you know, the Mike Zeck drawn, I don't remember who wrote it, I don't really care, because it wasn't that good, but the, you know, whole Circle of Blood is now referred to as. You know, Wolverine, you know, starting to get his, you know, X-Men is starting, because we got Mutant Massacre all of a sudden. You know, it's just everything, you know, I mean, Dark Phoenix Saga obviously predates all this stuff, but it wasn't, you know, it ended in this kind of really sad way, but it was about self-sacrifice, and it was about preserving, you know, integrity and so on and so forth, as Jean basically allows herself to die. But, you know, but then, you know, but Mutant Massacre, again, that was another thing that was the offspring of these two comics right here. You know, everything was demanding, we need to get darker, we need to get more serious now, because look at how, you know, how much media attention has gone to these other books, and how people seem to really be liking the dark stuff now. Well, we got to turn, everybody's got to have a dark, at least one story arc that's really dark and really disturbing. You know, which is why, you know, Spider-Man had Kraven's Last Stand, or Kraven's Last Hunt. You know, I mean, it's really good, you know, J.M. DeMatteis and Mike Zeck, you know, teaming up to do this really, you know, disturbing Spider-Man tale. But at the same time, it just didn't seem like Spider-Man anymore. And then also out of that same period, you got one of my favorite one-shots of all time, which was Spider-Man versus Wolverine, which is where, you know, which was actually not too recent, you know, not all that long ago, touched upon by Dan Slott during his run, during the No One Dies arc, where it goes back to, yes, Spider-Man actually killed this woman, not because he meant to. He thought that she was Wolverine, and, you know, he could hit Wolverine as hard as he wanted, but he, you know, he killed this, you know, he punched this woman's skull in, essentially. So it was like, it really did. It robbed the innocence away from these characters. Not that they were all that innocent to begin with, but now, in the last decade, we've seen a return to how kind of joyous and bizarre comic books can get. So there is, yes, there's a comic book that is bright and lively and colorful and full of big hero-villain battles. And then you do have the stuff that's either from Vertigo or from Icon or from Image that does allow for the darkness to pervade and to grow and to shock and disturb us and make us think, wow. You know, it's like, but ultimately, what I have to say about this is that these, while they were bad for things for a while, ultimately they turned they turned everything around and made things better. Because I wouldn't be a fan of comics right now. I wouldn't have gotten back into comics after a long time of collecting them and then stopping collecting them and then collecting again and again and then stopping. But I wouldn't be a fan of comics right now if they hadn't started doing series like Preacher or Why the Last Man. You know, these very kind of postmodern tales. And, you know, there was still a sense of joy that was being brought back slowly but surely to comic books. because you had, for instance, you had, you know, Brian Bendis doing Spider-Man, doing Ultimate Spider-Man, and that's a really fun comic. Of course, it ends up being really dark, but and then now you have Dan Slott doing Spider-Man, and he knows Spidey intimately. He knows how to make the jokes work. He knows how to make it light and fun when he wants it to be. When he wants to be a little bit more serious, he'll make it a little bit more serious. But it has become, Spider-Man, Amazing Spider-Man, has become one of my favorite titles on the shelves because it does have a more literary quality about it now. We actually have a really brilliant writer on Spider-Man. And he writes very, very, very well. He's an absolute genius at doing Spider-Man. We're not too crazy about this whole ends of the earth thing. That's been kind of it hasn't been bad, but it hasn't been that great. And, but Batman has never changed. Batman has never come back from being the Dark Knight. Batman Year One, The Killing Joke, The Death in the Family. This was just, then, we had Nightfall, and, Night Quest, and Night's End, and, Prodigal, and, then all of a sudden we, started getting, it kept maintaining the same kind of level of darkness, even if it wasn't the same quality. But it remained dark all throughout, and we still have this really dark Batman, and this is how it should be. This is what I think, for instance, that people like O'Neill and Adams were trying to do in the late 60s and in the 70s, was trying to get this kind of level of darkness back, but still maintain within kind of the status quo of the character. And what we have now, what we've seen particularly from Scott Snyder lately, is this return. Not only a brilliant and literary return to this character, but we've also seen him. We've also seen them have a little bit more. I hate to use the word fun with the character. And that's mostly because, we have Dick Grayson. We had Dick Grayson for a while as Batman. But, again, all of these characters, Captain America, went dark. There were, and then especially in the 80s and the 90s, you couldn't have a successful comic book if at least you didn't have a crossover with Wolverine or the Punisher. So imagine everybody's heads exploding when Punisher War Journal number 6 and 7 came out, and it was the Punisher fighting Wolverine. So it was really, and that was Rob Liefeld, I think, was doing the art on that, if I'm not mistaken. But, was it Liefeld? I think it was. I don't know. It was somebody very big. I believe it was Liefeld. At least it wasn't Eric Larson. But, so yeah, you had, so and these were two inherently dark characters, and they just kept getting darker and darker and darker. And, so their influence helped to bring, these books' influence helped to change things. For a while, they were bad. Trust me, I know. I lived through it. So, for a while, things were really bad because they were too dark. People, characters that weren't supposed to go dark went dark. And, you had then people like Mark Waid who came along and, said, what, this, Flash is getting a little too dark. Let's start making it light again. And then, of course, my friend Brian Augustyn co-writing and editing that comic. But, so it's always going to be a matter of time before things correct themselves. So, when people talk about these books and they talk about the 80s and they talk about, oh man, comic books, it's like they just weren't any fun anymore. Well, ultimately people just have to wait sometimes. And the courses do correct themselves. Wrongs are made right. I guess the thing is, really more than anything, is to don't give up on something because it's not going the way that you want it to. Because eventually the right people will come by and they'll say, yeah, you know what? Let's change this up a little bit. For instance, Mark Waid again, coming on Daredevil. Because, I mean, as much as I love, particularly Brubaker's run on Daredevil, but also Bendis and Miller, and, Nocenti, it was, I mean, he was getting the shit beat out of him for a long time. So, what to do with that, I mean, what was the next point to that? What was the next thing that was going to happen? So, that's really what I wanted to say. I just wanted to discuss 1986 and these two books, Batman the Dark Knight, or Batman the Dark Knight Returns, excuse me. I don't want to confuse that with the really awful Batman the Dark Knight that's going on right now. But the Dark Knight Returns and Watchmen. And say, this ushered in this era that, robbed characters of their innocence, made things a lot darker, but it took a while. We're back to where we have a good balance, where things can be light and things can be dark, and they don't always have to meet. Because we've got good people working, we've got some really, really good people working in this industry right now. And so, I mean, if you have an independent comic out there that's, that you think has a really talented guy on it, make sure that you buy it. Make sure that you recommend it as much as you possibly can. Because these are the people that will eventually save us from the next downturn in comics. So keep, don't give up on Saga. Don't give up on Morning Glories, or so many, there's so many different independent comics that, they will, these creators, they'll help us eventually if we let them. Last of the Greats, one of my favorite comics of the last year. It might die on the vine, and it shouldn't. It really shouldn't, because Josh Fialkov he's done such an incredible job on books like I, Vampire and Elk's Run and Echoes, and I mean, this is a really smart guy. So I mean, just if there's a title that you see is not doing so well, and it's a title that you like, make sure to pick up a copy. And make sure to recommend a few to your friends. Buy a couple for your friends. Whatever. It's worth it. I mean, because the big names, they're not going anywhere. It's the little ones we have to worry about. Those are the ones we have to care about and cultivate. Anyway, alright. So that's really it. I'm done for tonight. On this wild tangent. I mean, this is, if I could, I would do this for another 3 hours. I would just talk out of my ass for another 3 hours. And you would just be like, what the fuck are you talking about? Just get away from me already. I'm shutting this video off. Anyway, many of you have probably already done that. But I'm hoping that you didn't, because I'm hoping that you've enjoyed the ride. Hoping that you've stayed and you've had fun. So, we'll be back on the main Shadow Gallery page will be my review of Watchmen. Now, I recorded this last week, I recorded that video last week before most of the other people started to put out their videos. So just roll with it. It's my style. It's my thing. I'm glad I did it the way that I did it. I know that there are going to be better videos. I know there's better reviews out there. There already have been. I've seen that. And I'm looking at you, Minutia Minute, because that was fucking fantastic. And you, Ghost Critic, and you, Agent 42Q, and you, Jay's Comics, and you, Howler Mouse. Can make me look bad, I swear. Anyway, so that's it for the ramblings of James Donnelly, your host to the Shadow Gallery. I really do hope you've enjoyed this, and I hope that if it's your first time here, I hope you subscribe. I hope you like it. And if you don't like it, let me know why. Probably because it was too long, and too long-winded, and too many different tangents. So, I'm going to stop now. Hose me down, because I can't stop. Alright, I'm leaving now. My reminder to you, as always, stay in the shadows.